All rise, please. Good morning and welcome to Day 5 of evidential hearings at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez and I am the hearings manager. There is no fire alarm testing expected today, so if the fire alarm goes off, please follow the fire exit signs and make your way to the muster point, which is the Hard Rock Hotel, Great Cumberland Place. On arrival at the muster point, please make yourself known to a fire marshal who will be wearing a high visibility jacket and who will be keeping a register of all attendees. The fire marshals will also be responsible for letting everyone know when it's safe to return in liaison with representatives from the Thistle Hotel. I now hand over to the Chairman. Chairman.
Thank you. I note we have a fairly full public gallery today, therefore what I'm about to say may come as news to some members of it. Any of you may use your mobile, handheld electronic devices to communicate to the outside world silently what is going on in this hearing room, what you've heard, the evidence you've heard, what you've seen. But you may not communicate anything until 10 minutes have elapsed since the event which you're describing occurred. You may not use those devices for recording what is going on here or photographing. The formal restrictions are set out in a document which is on, I think, each table in front of you. Please consult it if you are in any doubt. Mr. Barr. Forgive me, you wish to be sworn, I think, Mr. Craft, do you not?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Please place your Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear.
I swear.
By Almighty God.
By Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Mr. Craft, I'm afraid you're in for quite a long day. We do have regular breaks, but if at any time you feel the need for a break, all you need to do is say so.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Barr.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Craft, could you tell us your full name, please?
I am Geoffrey Theodore Michael Craft.
And you have provided us with two witness statements dated the 7th of December 2020 and the 23rd of February 2022. We understand through your legal team that you wish to make 3 corrections to the first of those witness statements. We understand that in your first witness statement at paragraph 70, you used the cover name Rick Gibson when you intended to use the real name Rick Clark. At paragraph 100, you stated that you did not recall the officer that we know as HN13 appearing in court. I'll give you a moment to check who that is.
Thank you. Yes.
You tell us through your legal team that in fact you do recall that. And then at paragraph 116, you stated that the idea of using deceased children's identities came from the day of the jackal. But in fact, we are told you think that the idea was popularised by the day of the jackal. We will go into those aspects in more detail in due course, but subject to those corrections, are the contents of your witness statements true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Can I start, please, with your training as a police officer? Were you trained on powers of entry, search, and seizure?
Yes.
Were you given any further training about the application of the law so far as it applies to powers of entry, search, and seizure in the context of undercover policing?
Not in the context of undercover policing.
Did you consider that the limitations on a police officer entering a private dwelling applied to the work of the SDS?
No, I did not.
Did you give it any thought?
No.
Would the same apply to powers of search and seizure?
Yes.
Did you have any training at all during what we call the Tranche 1 era, that is between about 1968 and about 1983, on the European Convention on Human Rights?
No.
Did you give that convention any consideration during that era?
No.
You've told us that you didn't have any training on discrimination. Did you give discrimination any consideration during the Tranche 1 era?
No.
Were you trained on the Peelian principles, Sir Robert Peel's principles of policing?
Yes.
And do you recall that one of those principles is that the ability of the police to perform their duties is dependent upon public approval of police actions?
Yes.
During your time with the SDS, did you give any consideration to whether the public would approve of what the SDS was doing?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion?
My conclusion was that the public, as a whole, are happy to live in a parliamentary democracy, and that the police, in preserving the law with public demonstrations, which are part of our parliamentary democracy, the police naturally need intelligence to ensure that their policing is appropriate.
Did you give any consideration to whether the level of intrusion in people's private and political lives was such that the public would have qualms?
No.
The next principle I would like to put to you is the one which says police must secure the willing cooperation of the public in voluntary observance of the law to be able to secure and maintain the respect of the public. Were you familiar with that principle?
Yes.
Did you consider that what the SDS was doing would command the respect of the public?
Yes.
Why did you hold that view?
Because, as I said before, it was supporting their lifestyle, their freedom. I think the difficulty here is that one needs intelligence to preserve those freedoms, and that is what I considered.
The third and final principle that I'd like to put to you is the one which states police at all times should maintain a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence.
I can't say I gave a great deal of thought to that long principle.
Righto. I'll move on then. Did you ever serve on the industrial desk in C Squad?
No.
I'm going to try now to anchor your dates of service, first of all with the SDS. We understand that you joined the SDS sometime in 1974. Is that right?
Yes. My recollection is that I came off protection in February 1974 following the change of government, and I was on another squad very briefly, and then I was switched into the SDS when Derek Bryce left.
There may be some uncertainty as to precisely when that was, but would it be possible that it was in the autumn of 1974?
No, it would have been the very early part of 1974.
And then you took command of the SDS in 1976 when Derek Neal was promoted, is that right?
That is correct.
Was that around the springtime of 1976?
I just don't remember.
According to your central record of service, you were substantively promoted to Detective Chief Inspector in November 1976. Is it right that there was a period before that time where you acted up and were head of the SDS?
That I don't recall. I simply remember that In fact, Derek Neal and I were both promoted about the same time, and he moved off, and I simply took over the role.
You were replaced by Ken Pride, weren't you?
So I'm told. I have forgotten that.
If you can't remember something, please just say so. We've got a document which shows you going to the security service, taking Mr. Pride with you and saying that he was going to be your successor. And that document refers to a meeting on the 15th of September 1977. Does that sound about right?
I don't recall anything about it, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Can I take you back then to the start of your service with the SDS? Did you get a handover?
No.
How did you know what to do?
I simply moved in there as Derek Neal's number two. We had worked together before for extensive periods and on and off. And so, literally, he and I discussed what the role entailed.
And presumably that would have covered, and I don't want you to name any names in this answer, but it would have covered who the undercover officers were?
Of course.
And what the job entailed in basic terms?
Yes.
Did it cover any past or present information about sexual activity as between undercover police officers and members of the public?
No.
Did it cover any discussion about the risk of such activity?
No.
Did it cover the legality of what the SDS was doing and any legal considerations?
No.
Did it cover any ethical questions?
No.
Did it cover what intelligence was being gathered
Yes.
and why it was being gathered
Yes.
and for whom?
Well, the basic responsibility of the SDS was to provide intelligence on public order activity. But it had a secondary role because of the activities of the SDS officers. They came in contact, obviously, with groups which were considered by the security service to be subversive. And from C Squad, or through C Squad, we reported as required on those groups. So that was intelligence on subversive activities, but the main purpose was public order.
And did Mr. Neal go into detail about the relationship between the SDS and the security service?
I don't think he did. I think we both understood it.
From your previous special branch work?
Yes.
Did it cover the relationship between the SDS and A8?
Yes.
And what did Detective Chief Inspector Neal, as he then was, tell you about that?
In the sense that the intelligence we were acquiring was vital for A8 in their policing of public order.
Did he tell you anything specifically about what it was that they valued?
No.
Did DCI Neal cover the relationship between the SDS and B and C squads?
Yes.
And in outline, what did he tell you about the relationship with C squad?
With C Squad?
Yeah.
Oh, in outline. And again, how much he told me and how much I already knew, I can't be specific. But in outline, that C Squad had the responsibility for supporting the security service in terms of subversion, and that they would request information. They would certainly be the group who would advise on where we should place our people. And everything we did on the subversion, in fact, everything we did, all the reports, we passed through C Squad for them to activate. So they would either pass it on to the security service or they would be the conduit for passing intelligence on to A8. Bearing in mind that C Squad had the responsibility of providing threat assessments on public order for A8, and therefore they may and did have other sources of information to make up their threat assessments. But the SDS, of course, was a major part.
And what was the relationship with B squad?
Very little, because of course at that stage, I can't remember exactly when things happened, but the Irish scene was becoming, in this country, was in terms of public order, was becoming far less, because the IRA was starting up again, was operating, and they didn't get involved much in public order. I suppose you could say from the Troops Out movement point of view, yes, but that was an umbrella organisation. But it was interesting to see from the SDS point of view how far that was affected by Irish Republican groups within Troops Out, which was a small part of Troops Out. The larger part was the normal, what's the word I want, the people involved in protest and demonstration.
Did DCI Neil explain to you that undercover police officers were using elements of the identities of deceased children?
Yes.
Did he tell you how that practice had started?
No, he didn't.
Do you know how that practice started?
No, sadly I don't. I appreciate that is of importance to the inquiry, but I just do not know when it started.
And does it follow that you can't help us either with who decided that practice should be adopted by the SDS?
No, I'm afraid not. I wish I could.
Something you touched on a moment ago. Did DCI Neil talk to you about target selection?
We discussed it. I can't see whether he briefed me on it. I think we discussed that at the time.
Can you recall what he said?
Largely, he said that we needed intelligence on public order, that there were certain groups who were very much involved in public order, and those were the areas we should cover.
Did he identify those groups?
Well, yes, we did between us, because that was happening in the office at the time.
Were you given any instructions or advice to review existing deployments?
No, I don't think so.
Now, can I move now to the question of how undercover police officers were recruited? And I just want to establish, first of all, who was recruited whilst you were head of the SDS. Was the officer we know as HN 297, whose real name is Richard Clark, was he already in the SDS when you started, or did you recruit him?
I believe he had just started, but I'm not certain.
Do you have any recollection of recruiting him?
I didn't recruit him personally, but I was involved, assisting his undercover background.
Can you recall whether he had a reputation with women?
I never knew that.
He's been described by some of his former colleagues as a womanizer, and in one case as a carnivore. Do those descriptions fit with your knowledge and understanding of Richard Clark?
No, certainly not.
Did you recruit the officer we know as HN 300?
May I,
Yes, of course.
please? No, I don't recall that.
He's been described by some as a womanizer and by others, I paraphrase, as a serial romantic. Does that description chime with your recollection of him?
No, it doesn't.
How would you describe, first of all, Richard Clark?
He seemed to be somebody who was affable, social activity. He seemed to mix well with the other people. Got along well with people. I didn't see anything unusual about him, put it that way.
And HN 300?
An interesting character, it seemed to be. Quite a funny character to deal with. looked absolutely nothing like a police officer. I can't imagine why he was ever a police officer, but the fact remains that from the, the job that we used him for, he would have slipped into any sort of organisation very easily. I think nobody would have thought he was a police officer.
Did you regard him as a suitable temperament for undercover policing?
Well, let's say I didn't know of any reason why he should not have been.
And the same question for Richard Clarke.
That would be correct, yes.
Now, on the basis of our understanding of the timeline, we think that HN13, and I'm going to read a series of names, if you could keep the file to the side, please. Yes. HN13, HN296, HN304, HN354, and possibly HN80 were all recruited while you were head of the SDS.
May I ask, could you repeat the last two?
Yes, 354, who is, his real name is no longer restricted, he's Vince Harvey, and
yes.
HN80.
HN80. Yes, in the total period, all the names I know, but I can't clear in my own mind about how much I was involved in the recruitment.
I see. Now,
Forgive me, do you recognise them all as being officers in the SDS?
Yes, sir,
when
I
you were
do.
in charge of it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
if you can't remember the specifics, I'll zoom out to the general. Now, all of these officers were either married or, in the case of Vince Harvey, in a long-term relationship when they were recruited to the SDS. Was that deliberate?
Yes, that was part of the criteria we looked at for recruitment.
And was one advantage of recruiting officers who were either married or in stable relationships that it reduced the risk of them becoming involved in sexual activity with members of the public in their undercover identities?
I can't say that. The thinking at the time was that they were in a stressful job. They're having to live two lives. And it was very important that they had a stable life to which they could return daily, preferably, to break away from the scene they were in. So it was more about stability, I think.
More about stability or entirely about stability?
I think, looking at the sexual bit, if I may, it was never discussed when I was there on the SDS, and it wasn't discussed because we were all trained from day one as probationary policemen that sexual activity on duty was putting oneself on the line for dismissal. And in fact, I still remember in my own case that, the instructor producing copies of old-fashioned police orders from, I think, about 1830, where PC blogs had been dismissed, having been caught with the housemaid from somewhere. And it was always stressed within the police service that sexual activity on duty was just not on. And that is probably why it was never discussed.
Can I move now from recruitment to the construction of cover identities? Now, you've explained to us in your witness statement that it was a bespoke process and that you were involved in it. Can I take an example? HN304.
Yes, sir.
Can you recall whether you discussed with him adopting not only the name and date of birth of the child in question, but also the locality in which he had been brought up?
No, I don't recall that.
Is that the sort of thing that you might well have done?
I might, but I cannot remember a specific occasion when I would have done so.
Can you recall in relation to any of the officers whose cover identities you assisted with, you suggested to them that it would be useful to visit the area where the child grew up?
No.
Are you saying you can't remember or you didn't do it?
I just don't remember doing it at all. I don't think so.
Can I ask you now, do you know whether or not the regional crime squad ever used this tactic?
No, I don't know.
Can I ask you now about HN 297, Richard Clark? Do you recall whether or not you assisted him to build his cover legend?
No, not specifically.
Forgive me, do you mean you don't recall doing it or you didn't?
I don't recall doing it specifically for him.
More generally then, did you generally check and test the cover identities generated by the UCOs before they deployed?
Check, no, but almost certainly discussed who, what kind of employment they had, those factors.
Was that a form of testing their robustness?
It was just a question of discussing,
For what purpose?
so that we knew how things were and did it make any sense.
So that you were satisfied that they were safe to be deployed?
Yes, because through the office, and I think it was the sergeants one of the sergeants who organised this, further details were made available to the chaps who were going into the field, including, of course, driving licences and one or two other things.
Did you consider the legality of using this practice?
No, I assumed it was legal.
Did you consider the ethics?
No, not at the time.
Can you recall whether any of the officers objected to using this tactic?
No.
Can you recall HN 80 having qualms about it?
80. No, I can't.
Does that mean that you can't remember or that he didn't?
He certainly didn't talk to me about it.
Did you consider the utility of the tactic?
Yes.
And in your view, what was the utility of the tactic?
It provided a safe base, really, from the stuff. In building an alter ego, it was the basis of that.
And was one aspect of the protection it provided that if anybody went to inspect the register of births, they would find a genuine entry?
Yes.
At a time when they were recorded in manuscript in a large volume and it was not possible to insert a false one.
It was not possible to insert a false one, no.
Did you consider the risk that the family of one of these children might find out?
Sadly to say, at the time I didn't. It didn't occur to me. My views on that obviously have changed since it did achieve publicity. And that changes one's view completely.
And what is your view now?
My view now is that it is the fact that the family of the bereaved family of a child who has died have suffered enough with that bereavement, and that if anything we did to exacerbate that, I think is very sad. Certainly there was never any intention to do that, and when I look back at it, I think, why did I not question it? And the reason, I think you will find in my statement, is that I had seen it used by somebody who was obtaining passports to attack this country, and I was involved in the prosecution of that. And also the fact that the people we were putting in the field were special branch officers who intended, most of them, I think, to see out their whole career within the special branch. They were in a top secret operation, and it seemed to be inconceivable that any of those would reveal it. And therefore, the parents of a deceased child should never, in fact, know about it. That is hindsight.
As it happened, one of your officers was suspected of not being who he said he was. That was Richard Clarke, wasn't it?
Yes.
Can you tell us, as far as you can recall it, what happened?
My best recollection, and I've tried to give a lot of thought to this, is that he called in and said that he was suspected of not being who he thought who he was saying he was, that he was called to a meeting in a public house somewhere in South London, and Derek Neal and I went out to keep observation on the pub in case he might be physically attacked. We kept observation outside. When he came out with, I think, 2 other people, I may be wrong about that, he gave no indication of any fear of any problem, anything at all. So he carried on, and Derek Neal briefed him the following day, and I'm pretty sure he said they had discovered that he had used the details of a deceased child, but that he'd got away with it with a story that, in fact, he'd had to do it because he was wanted by police, and he thought that had been accepted. That is sum total, I'm afraid, of what I can remember.
But is it right that he was, in fact, then withdrawn?
He was withdrawn, yes.
And why was that?
I think it was felt that he would always be under suspicion, and there was little point in leaving him out there.
Did he say whether or not there had been any other circumstances which had led to suspicion falling upon him?
No, he did not.
Did he tell you that he had been involved with members of the opposite sex?
No, certainly not.
How was Richard Clarke's compromise presented to the other undercover officers by either you or, as I think you then was, Superintendent Neal?
No, I simply can't remember, I'm sorry.
We've had some evidence to the effect that officers were told that he had been confronted with his death certificate. Might that have happened?
It might well.
After that...
Forgive me, 2 questions in that. He might well have been confronted with his death certificate, and officers might have been told that.
I simply can't remember, sir. I'm sorry.
That experience showed you, didn't it, that there were limits to the protection afforded by using a deceased child's identity?
It did, but I have to say, looking back, I find it fascinating that they were able to produce the death certificate, because there is no direct connection, having been involved in inquiries in another field within the branch. The death registers were separate. That the only, if you have got you're looking at a birth, if you want to find a death certificate, or you did in those days, if you wanted to find a death certificate, you would literally have to go through goodness knows how many books, year after year after year, and also in the area concerned to discover the death certificate. And then you'd have, if you're a member of the public, I think you would have to pay for somebody else, an official, to go down to check the death certificate, and also if you wanted it to get a copy. So it was not an easy process. It's quite difficult, in fact.
Did the compromise of Richard Clarke cause you to revisit the utility of this tactic?
No, it didn't.
Did it cause you to revisit the risks that a family might one day find out?
No, it didn't.
Can I move now to training of undercover police officers?
Before you do, may I ask one question about Richard Clarke? We have heard from other officers about sexual relationships which he was thought to have had when deployed. You have no recollection of that, of knowing anything about that at the time. If he had told you that part of the reason for his discovery was that he had had a sexual relationship with a woman in his cover name, what would you have done about it?
I would have removed him from the field immediately.
Anything else?
Then had to consider what action we could take, because clearly he had put at risk not only himself, his family, and the operation. One would have had to consider what future he had.
In the police force, you mean?
Yes.
Putting it in blunter language, he would have been considered for disciplinary action, which might have resulted in his removal from the police force.
Yes, the only caveat on that, sir, is that bearing in mind his rights, should there be a discipline board, what would he have said, what might have been published? We were operating in a top secret area, and I can't honestly say what decision would have been made about that.
Thank you, sir. Training of undercover police officers. Can you recall whether or not there was a black folder with advice and guidance for undercover police officers or any other written material to assist them?
Not that I can recall.
Why weren't they given any such guidance?
We were still at a time believing that on-the-job training applied throughout the branch. That was the case, and this was specific, and so the training they received was within the office, talking to the people in the office, but also out in the field. We used to meet twice a week with the field officers. The trainee would come out there and would chat. They would chat about how things were done, what the problems might be, how they should play things. So the training was on the job. There was no specific training program.
Can I move now to targeting? I'm going to start by showing you a document which it's part of the 1983 annual report. Sir, it's at tab 37B of your bundle. It is MPS-0730-903.
I'm lacking a bundle, I think.
It'll come up on your screen.
Oh, thank you.
Do you want the reference again? It was MPS-0730-903. 30903. I'll tell you what, just for this document, I will read it to you. I'm reading from page 10 of the digital reference pagination, paragraph 9. It's a paragraph about security. It says, to avoid duplication of effort by other sources, the initial placing of each officer is arrived at by reference to squad chief superintendents and the security service to ensure greater customer satisfaction. However, it remains the final decision of the officer in charge of the unit which groups are infiltrated, bearing in mind the demands and fluctuations of key areas within the public order scene. Does that accord with your recollection of how it was done when you were in charge of the SDS?
The last part of it, I'm not quite sure. Targeting would have been from Chief Superintendent C Squad, who would be relaying and supporting the security service in their area, but also the public order area. Bear in mind that Chief Superintendent C Squad was the one who had to produce the assessments on public order. We were simply a support service in that, a major support service, but that's what we were. The decision in terms of exactly where an undercover officer was placed would be affected quite often, no, not quite often, sometimes, where we had to get his personality right. And it could be that one would put him in somewhere fairly simple, where we knew he would be picked up without a problem before he became known as a revolutionary and he could move on elsewhere. So I think that is the only part where Chief Inspector SDS would have become involved.
What is your recollection about who had the ultimate decision-making authority?
It would have to be Chief Inspector SDS, because Chief Inspector SDS had the responsibility for protecting his people.
And does it follow from that, nevertheless, that very considerable consideration would have been given to the views of Chief Superintendent C Squad?
Oh, absolutely.
And B Squad?
Yes, but less so B Squad, because it was not really much involved in my time.
And whatever was coming to the head of the SDS from the security service, either directly or via more senior exchanges with Metropolitan Police Special Branch?
From the security service via Chief Superintendent Z Squad.
Now, you've described what you've called prayers occurring every morning at Special Branch. We're not talking religious prayers, are we?
We are not, sir, no.
This is the senior officers of Special Branch conferring every morning to talk business briefly. Is that right?
It was the senior officers of the operational part of Special Branch meeting up with, I'm talking about chief superintendents of the operational squads meeting up with Commander Ops.
And from your experience of being privy to some of those meetings. Was the targeting of SDS officers a topic of conversation?
Not that I can ever remember.
Does that mean it might have been?
Could have been, but generally speaking, it wouldn't have reached that level because it would have been discussed with Chief Superintendent C Squad. Commander Ops wouldn't have been particularly concerned, I don't think.
Without mentioning any of the deployments of anonymous officers, can you help us with what considerations you took into account when you were deciding how and where to deploy the officers who were recruited on your watch?
Yes, it would depend. The first factor would be where we were light on intelligence. And moving on from there, how would one get somebody into that area?
And the next consideration?
I think that was the first and only consideration.
First and only consideration.
Yes, anything else?
I see. So that might be paraphrased as a decision based on need.
Yes.
Did you consider whether there were alternative ways of obtaining sufficient intelligence from a group on which you were light?
Not on S Squad. That would be down to Chief Superintendent C Squad. If Chief Sup C had alternative sources, and very often had some, in a broader sense, but a decision whether we needed detailed intelligence, of course, would come from him, not from me, not from Chief Sup S.
Was there any consideration of whether the level of intrusion that would be involved was proportionate to the value of the intelligence that would be obtained?
I can't say there was. I think that's difficult to balance. I can't say that.
Once you had deployed somebody, was there any form of review, formal or otherwise, of the deployment?
There was a continuing review of every individual deployment. Was it producing? Was the need to continue? Would it be better if that particular person could be elsewhere? But that was a continuing process. There wasn't a specific review.
And I think you've mentioned in your witness statement it was not necessarily an easy thing to do to move somebody once they were deployed.
No, not necessarily. But again, I come back to what I said before, that there were one organisation in particular was quite easy to get into, and that could produce a persona who, and that way, would make it easier for somebody to move into another organisation.
We're talking about the Socialist Workers'
Yes.
Party. You mentioned that not only today but also in your witness statement. But could I also ask you, is it right that the SDS regarded the SWP as a likely source of public disorder?
Yes.
So it would not be right to characterise deployment into the SWP purely as a stepping stone. It was also a target in its own right. Is that right?
Of course.
And in the scale of likelihood of causing public disorder compared to other groups, where was the SWP?
Well, they were the largest, and they therefore could produce more numbers and were effective at infiltrating campaigns for their own purposes.
We've got a note in the bundle of a meeting with the security service where they have recorded your view that the SWP was most likely to give rise to law and order problems. Have they accurately recorded your view?
Yes, I think so.
Now, we've talked thus far about which group an officer should be deployed into. How often did you get specific requests once an officer was in a group to cover specific meetings?
Seldom.
And what was the attitude when you did receive such requests?
Oh, I think our response would be yes, certainly, if we could.
And that would be the same whether it came from C Squad or the security service?
I didn't deal directly with the security service over that.
Now, can I just ask you about how the Cold War influenced the operation of the SDS during your time as head? Would it be fair to say that the Cold War was an important part of the factual matrix?
I don't really know the answer to that. The Cold War was important in the sense that the Communist Party of Great Britain was busy infiltrating trade unions and that sort of activity to put Soviet influence into what was happening in our political scene. I don't think the Cold War was particularly of particular importance on the public order front.
And was it a relevant consideration that many of the groups on the ultra-left did not have the support of foreign powers, unlike the CPGB?
Certainly unlike the CPGB.
Can I take it you're agreeing with me in that answer?
I'm agreeing with you. My smile is simply because we were dealing with one or two interesting so-called Maoist groups who probably felt they were supporting the activities of Chairman Mao or even Enver Hoxha, who was the leader, the dictator of Albania, would you believe? But
Albania not quite in the same league as the
not
USSR.
Exactly, no.
And the Trotskyists, no foreign support at all at nation-state level?
No.
Can I move now to your liaison with the security service? You've made it quite plain that the normal state of affairs was contact was at a higher level. But it is right, isn't it, that there was some contact between you and the security service? We've got some notes of meetings.
There was some contact, but so far as S Squad was concerned, so I'm thinking now both as Chief Superintendent and as Chief Inspector SDS, my contact with the security service was minimal, I think.
Let's just look at one example. Could we have up, please, UCPI 5027451, which is tab 8. Now, this is the security service's record of a meeting which occurred on the 8th of January 1976, where you and Detective Chief Inspector Derek Neal had gone to see the security service. The first part of the note seems to deal with a tricky issue of what to do when the security service were asking for identifying inquiries to be made of one of your undercover officers. Mm-hmm. So that was an operational issue directly concerning the SDS, and was that the sort of thing where you would have direct contact with them?
Yes, but that's about the only time I can remember that happening.
And if we go towards the bottom of the page, paragraphs 5 and 6, there's a slightly different issue which it's convenient to deal with now. Paragraph 5 reads, "The question from Detective Inspector, redacted, of Sussex was, why don't you try to persuade chief constables to adopt the Metropolitan Police Special Branch system of using young Special Branch officers as agents?" And the security service officer is saying, "I had parried the question in open session, but had subsequently taken it up with Detective Chief Superintendent Stanton of Merseyside to see whether this concept was widely known in provincial special branches. He had said that it was, and that in fact the special branch course run by MPSB had a whole lecture on the SDS and its successors, including the penetration of," then we've had to redact that. I did not give Neil details, but told him I had sidestepped the question and was now merely asking whether MPSB did discuss this concept of agent running with provincial branches. He said it had once been discussed on one course only by Detective, it says Detective Constable, but that can't be right, Dixon, and that it had been a mistake. The subject was not now mentioned, and when raised as a query was sidestepped precisely as we had sidestepped it. He thanked me for letting him know and hoped we would continue to keep the whole subject as close a secret as possible. It seems from those two paragraphs, Mr. Craft, that the cat had got out of the bag about the SDS's existence to regional special branches.
Yes, that is new to me, and I should have known about this. I am surprised, because I thought we kept it pretty close.
Are you able to help us from your recollection as to the extent to which the cat had got out of the bag?
No, I'm afraid I'm not. I'm surprised. This is the first I knew of it.
Did you ever have telephone contact with the security service? Would they call you if there was something urgent, and would you call them likewise?
Not on S-Squad, no.
In the SDS? Are you including the SDS in
I'm
S-Squad?
including, yes. Sorry, yes.
The meeting in question that we've just looked at didn't have a reference to drinks afterwards, but some of the minutes we've got do refer to drinks afterwards. Would you sometimes socialise with the security service personnel after a meeting?
I was shown a security service minute or a memo relating to a drink in a pub after a meeting. That's the only one I can recall. And I don't remember meeting them in a pub, I'm afraid. I have a problem here because later on, and also in another life, I was involved rather more often with the security service, and we did socialise sometimes, but I don't think so on S-Squad.
When there had been contact between the security service and the special branch at senior levels, and it was fed down to you, were you aware that it had come from the security service, or was that withheld from you?
No, I would have been aware.
And how common was it for communications from the security service to be fed down to you through the chain of command?
Not very often.
And did they tend to be requests for intelligence?
Yes.
Can I move now, please, to the definition of subversion? I'm going to start by asking that we have up, please, UCPI 604459. This is a circular to all Chief Constables dated the 15th of June 1970, and it encloses terms of reference for special branch. So if we scroll down to the next page, please. Do you recall whether or not you were ever shown the 1970 terms of reference for special branch?
I was not.
If we go, please, to paragraph 3D, which is a list of tasks, it says, in consultation with the security service to collect, process and record information about subversive or potentially subversive organisations and individuals. Was it your understanding that it was MPSB's task to do that?
Yes.
And what information were you given to help you judge what was a subversive or potentially subversive organisation and individual?
Well, from the outset in Special Branch, we learned what was considered subversive by the Security Service because we were responding to Security Service requests. And so the definition of a subversive organisation was something upon which we relied from the Security Service.
If we go in this document to page 4, paragraph 3, this is part of the appendix on function. It says, it is important that special branches should have a clear idea of what constitutes persons and organisations which may be judged to be subversive of the security of the state. Broadly speaking, these are any organisation or individual whose purpose is the undermining or overthrow of the established democratic order. First of all, was that ever explained to you?
I'm sure it was very early on.
And secondly, in the period 1970 to 1974, was this your understanding of what a subversive organisation was?
Yes.
Did that understanding change?
No.
Can we take that down, please? Can we have now UCPI 604545? This is again a circular to all chief constables in England and Wales. It's from the Security Service and it's dated May 1974. It is about subversive activities in industrial disputes. Could we have a look, please, towards the bottom of page 2? Paragraph 7. In this connection, it may be helpful to remind you of the distinction we draw between subversion and militancy in industrial disputes in the following definitions. Subversion is defined as activities threatening the safety or well-being of the state and intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. Stopping there, do you recall seeing this document?
No.
Do you recall ever having this definition of subversion drawn to your attention?
I can't remember it being drawn to my attention, but I certainly understood that.
Well, there is a difference between the definition I first showed you and this one. In particular, first of all, it talks about threatening the safety or well-being of the state, in addition to the intention. Did anybody emphasise to you that before a group could be considered subversive, it had not only to want to overthrow parliamentary democracy, but had also to actually threaten the safety and well-being of the state?
No, that distinction was never considered.
And would it be fair to say it wasn't ever applied in practice?
I can't think so.
It then goes on to say industrial militancy is defined as readiness to use or threaten the use of strikes, sit-ins, and other forms of aggressive action in the furtherance of industrial disputes, and an unwillingness to seek or accept compromise solutions through negotiations, conciliation, or arbitration. And if we can go over the page, please. Militancy in pursuit of trade union disputes with employers is not subversive unless the motivation and purpose of the militants is primarily political and threatens the parliamentary democratic system. Opposition to industrial policies of the government of the day is not in itself subversive. Was that distinction made clear to you?
I certainly understood it.
If we could take that down, please. And if we could have up, please, UCPI 5013858. Now, this is a report dated the 17th of March 1980. And if we could scroll down, please, to see who signed it. Page 4, please. That's not signed by you, but by Mr. Moss. And if we go to the top of the document again, it's about the TUC's Rally Against the Cuts campaign in central London. So accepting this is not something you're personally involved in, which side of the line would Rally Against the Cuts organised by the TUC fall?
Perfectly legitimate. The interest from the point of view of the SDS was that, or anybody in the branch, was what is going to happen in terms of public order.
Would it make a difference if there were people who would be described as the ultra-left trying to infiltrate that campaign?
It would be very interesting, because maybe that's where the problem would occur. If I may say here that generally speaking, TUC activity was not a major police problem. 30,000 trade unionists marching through London on May Day was never going to be a problem. I think the only thing police had to worry about was keeping the marchers clear of the traffic, whereas a small organisation with 50 people determined to attack Downing Street could involve about 200 policemen.
If we could take that down now, please. If we could have UCPI 5034701 up, please. Now, this is a Home Office discussion paper dating from 1980. It's part of a course of correspondence we found showing that the Home Office were expressing some concerns about Special Branch and its relationship with the security service. First of all, were you aware of any concern within the Home Office when you were the Chief Superintendent of Esquad in the early 80s about Special Branch's relationship with the security service?
No, I was not.
My interest for today's purposes is very specific. If we could go to page 2, paragraph 4, right at the very bottom. Paragraph 4 proposes a further revision of the definition of subversion. Reads, subversive activities are defined as those which threaten the safety or well-being of the state and which are intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial or violent means. Stopping there, that's the last definition I showed you. But then it adds, this includes the activities of organisations or individuals which, while operating at present within the law, have as their long-term aim the overthrow of parliamentary democracy. Would that rider have clarified what in fact was being done?
No, I think we were within that, so that wouldn't have clarified anything, I don't think, for me.
Because you were already doing it?
We were operating that way anyway.
Did it cause you any concern as a police officer that you were being asked to report on people who were conducting lawful activities?
No. It was the fact, again, I'm coming back down to public order. If what was happening there was affected us in terms of public order, that would certainly been along in our area of responsibility. Equally, if we were doing it on behalf of the security service, we had to rely upon the fact that they were operating within the rules.
So it comes back to reliance upon the security
It has
service.
to be.
Did you ever address your mind to whether or not it was appropriate as a police officer to be doing this?
No, I did not.
Can we take that down, please? Can we have up UCPI 5034698? This is another circular, this time from the Security Service to Chief Constables. It's dated the 16th of December 1975, and it is entitled Subversive Activities in Schools. If we could go to page 2, please. Paragraph 2 reads, "We do not ask you to make inquiries in schools on our behalf, but we would welcome any help you could give us on the basis of information which comes your way from the local papers or from members of the public, or by recourse to other sources outside schools which you can use without risk of embarrassment." Do you recall getting any guidance about subversive activities in schools?
No, I don't. The only time I think we would have been involved at all would be if school kids were involved with one of the organisations that we were monitoring for public order purposes.
The inquiries received evidence that both the far right and the far left were moving into schools. Does that accord with your recollection?
I don't remember the far right doing it. I certainly remember a little bit of the far left, but not a great deal. I don't remember the far right getting involved, not in my time. May have been, but I don't recall it.
And we have seen SDS reports about children who were active with groups like School Kids Against the Nazis. On what basis were you, as an organisation, reporting this sort of thing?
I can only, I have no direct recollection of this, but it would be because something like an organisation of that name would have been almost certainly SW supported, organised, led probably.
Did you mean SWP?
I mean SWP, sorry, Socialist Worker, SWP, yes, various names.
The circular I've just read to you expresses a fear of embarrassment. Did you consider there were any sensitivities about reporting on children?
No.
Are you able to help us with what embarrassment was feared?
No, I don't recall it arising. We were dealing with public order again.
We can take that down now, please. Standing back now on the question of subversion, with hindsight, do you think you were given sufficient training about the definition of subversion?
I don't know. What I would say, all I can answer there is that I come back to an earlier answer in the sense that a lot of training was on the job, and that as a young special branch officer on C Squad, I absorbed all that kind of material, and so I was quite comfortable with what was considered subversive and what was not. Later on, of course, when we were looking at the industrial scene, again, I was very clear in my own mind about what was subversive and what was not.
And that turned upon whether or not the group had subversive aims.
Of course. Or whether there were groups infiltrating an industrial dispute, for example.
Do you think that the undercover officers were given sufficient training on what was and what was not subversive?
I can't answer that. I don't know. They had no specific training on that.
I'm going to move now to a different topic, and that's the process of reporting. I think you've already covered this to some extent. But was the system such that if something was very urgent, you would telephone A8 or send them a telegram?
It was unusual that SDS would telephone A8. Usually, everything passed through C Squad to go to A8. There would be the occasion, we used to cover the office at weekends when there were demonstrations on, and if an SDS officer called in and said, look, this or that is going to happen, then yes, the officer would, in our office, would phone through to a special branch liaison in the uniform ops room to let them know what was happening.
But for most routine intelligence, it went via C Squad,
Oh, yes.
and they decided who
Yes.
to disseminate it to. Did you ever have any experience of compiling threat assessments yourself?
No, not on S Squad.
Did you ever have that experience on C Squad?
No.
Do you know what proportion of SDS intelligence was sent to the security service?
A large proportion. I don't know exactly how it goes, but a large proportion.
Do you know what proportion of the intelligence that was used to write A8 threat assessments was derived from SDS reporting and what was derived from other sources?
I would have thought a great deal of it came from SDS.
Now, you say you would have thought, but having not done the job yourself, are you in a position of authority to tell us what the proportion was?
No, I'm not.
And again, if it's beyond your knowledge, please say so. But would it be right that A8 and C Squad would have been able to consider public order threats using sources such as flyers, the past activity of a group, the nature of an issue, the timing of a proposed demonstration in relation to an incendiary event, or just by talking to the organisers and things like that?
I think a lot of it came from discussions between C Squad and A8. Yes, clearly, and this would be a C Squad area, being fully aware of what was happening in society, what was likely to occur. And of course, in many cases, there would be discussion between A8 and the organisers of activities.
Are you able to help us with what it was that SDS intelligence brought to the whole picture that would otherwise have been missing?
Oh, without doubt. The intentions of revolutionary groups so far as a particular public order activity was concerned. And so it might well be that a perfectly straightforward, what usually happens, perfectly straightforward demonstration was not going to create a problem, but the SDS would be able to feed in whether there was going to be any problem from revolutionaries who were infiltrating it and determined to become involved and to use it. And
to ask perhaps an obvious question, we're talking about groups which did not cooperate with the police.
Absolutely. A big factor, if I may, perhaps it helps the inquiry here, that it was almost as important to be able to assure the uniform branch there was not going to be any trouble, and so therefore the numbers of police concerned could be kept to the minimum, as to say, yes, there is going to be a problem, or there is likely to be a problem, and this is where it could happen, and these are the people who may do it. So there were the two factors there. I think it's very important to remember that we do not in this country have a French CRS, or we don't have a National Guard in America. We don't have a barracks full of policemen we can pull out to deal with public order. But every time we do police public order, and that is a police responsibility, those officers come from normal policing duties. And of course that affects the protection of the public around London. So that was one of the factors we always had in mind.
Was the immediacy with which an SDS undercover officer could report a significant factor?
Oh, yes.
Could you explain?
Sorry?
Could you explain, or using an officer who's not anonymous, give us an example?
No, I can't give you an example, but there were occasions when somebody who was a part of a group and was going to be involved in a demonstration might somehow better slip away to a telephone box and make a call. Bear in mind we had no mobile phones in those days. And that's why we manned the office at a week when there was a demonstration going on.
Can I move now to reports on individuals? Reports on individuals would have been kept within special branch files, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And in many occasions sent to the security service as well.
Yes.
Why did Special Branch want reports on individuals?
Special Branch wanted reports on individuals largely because the security service were interested in them. And what would happen is the security service would be in touch continually with C Squad, the branch C Squad, asking for updates on people, and the branch kept files to avoid duplication of effort, really, so that we knew who they were talking about, what the situation was, and we could answer the questions, if necessary, making further inquiries.
Would reports on individuals have been used by Special Branch for its own purposes? For example, in compiling threat assessments for A8?
Only in the sense that the individuals concerned were people who were known to behave in certain ways on demonstrations. That's the only reason I can think of.
Would they have been used for vetting?
Not by Special Branch, because the only vetting Special Branch was involved with was the Irish Republican field, because Special Branch carried prime responsibility for Irish Republican activity in Great Britain, and therefore any vetting inquiries were passed through Special Branch. But in terms of subversion, that was Security Service.
Would they have been used by the industrial desk if they involve trade union members or trade union matters?
I don't know. I can't really answer that question.
We've heard evidence from officers that amounts to an unfiltered approach to gathering intelligence and incorporating it into reports. Is that a fair way to describe how intelligence was gathered by SDS undercover officers? Yes,
they would report on what they were learning in the organisations where they were employed, and they felt that we couldn't stress or even tie down what they reported. They reported into the office. The reports were, if you like, drafted in the office, typed up, and then passed on to C Squad for action.
And it was left for others to assess and analyse.
Oh yes.
We also know that the unfiltered content tended to be recorded in reports, and we found it on Special Branch files and Security Service files half a century or so later. So is it fair to say that there wasn't a great deal of filtering going on even within C Squad?
I think you're probably right, yes.
We've put in your bundle a number of reports about deeply personal matters relating to individuals. If you want to be reminded, I can turn them up, but we may be able to do this without doing so. There's one about the pregnancy of a woman, another about a heart attack suffered by one of the inquiry's equal participants. There's a report about a bank account. There's a report about union affiliation, report about a schoolgirl, report about somebody's infidelity, and a report about a woman's children, and another report about the sexuality of an anarchist's partner. Was there any policing value in recording intimate personal details like this?
I don't think there's any policing value in that.
And does it follow from your answer that you think this information was recorded for the security service, or do you think it was the product of a lax attitude to what was recorded, or both?
I think it was recorded for the security service, and I think it's something which clearly, 50 years on, we'd have looked at very carefully.
Thank you. Would now be a convenient moment to break, sir?
Yes, it would. Before we do, I wonder whether one of the documents that you put up could be put up again. I think it was UCPI with either 5 or 6 zeros, 34701. The Home Office discussion paper in which lawfulness was mentioned.
That's right.
Can you remind me of the
Bottom of the next page.
bottom of the next page?
Yeah, that's where, at bottom of paragraph 4 is where the definition starts.
Yes. Could I ask you just to read that again, please, and could it be scrolled down so that you can?
Subversive activities
Yeah.
are defined as those which threaten the safety or well-being of the state and which are intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial or violent means. This includes the activities of organisations or individuals which, while operating at present within the law, have as their long-term aim the overthrow of parliamentary democracy.
Thank you. I particularly want to focus on the last sentence. During your time as head of the SDS or as chief superintendent of S-Squad, was there any infiltration of organisations or individuals who were at present operating within the law but had as their long-term aim the overthrow of parliamentary democracy, who did not pose a then current risk to public order?
I don't think so, sir.
No. Thank you. We will break now for a quarter of an hour.
all rise, please.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Craft, I'm going to move now in a little bit more detail to public order. And I want to consider at this stage, two particular events. The first of all is the dispute at the Grunwick factory. If we could go, please, to tab 28 in the bundle, that's MPS-0728981. This is the SDS annual report for 1977, and if we could go within the document to page 11. At paragraph 19 at the bottom of the page deals with the Grunwick dispute. The paragraph, as it appears on the bottom of this page, is essentially describing a peaceful piece of industrial action. And I'll give you a moment to absorb the content.
Yes.
If you go over the page, and the story changes. I'll give you a moment to read the rest of that paragraph. And for those who are listening, I had better read it. Following a poorly attended demonstration in April 1977, the dispute was taken up by the ultra-left, and throughout June, July and August, Trotskyist-inspired violence escalated in the streets surrounding the Grunwick factory, and especially at the two entrances to Grunwick's, where mobs inspired by the ultra-left attempted to prevent the employees' coaches from entering the factory. And then if we go down to paragraph 21, throughout this dispute, invaluable information was supplied by the SDS of last-minute tactics and of the numbers attending and degree of violence anticipated, which enabled the uniform branch to effectively police one of the most violent and long-standing disputes for many years. Then, unfortunately, we've had to redact the specific example which is given. And it says this information was immediately passed to Commander A8 in the presence of a small number of uniformed police at this location prevented an embarrassing and effective tactic. Now, what I would like to know, please, without any details because of the restriction orders, is were the SDS providing intelligence that nobody else could have obtained, or were they obtaining intelligence which could have been obtained from other sources but just doing so more efficiently?
No, I think they were obtaining intelligence which was not available elsewhere.
If we could take that down, please, and move to the Battle of Lewisham, which you describe in your statement as a new era. Can we start with the document at tab 20, which is UCPI 50/11/180. Now, this is a report after the demonstration about the Communist Party of England, ML. And can we look in particular at paragraph 3, which starts, details of the party's strategy for Lewisham had rather typically been given to rank and file supporters and contacts at, quote, the very last minute on the Saturday morning. And further on down, it describes that they were splitting into two groups, one which was going to be stationed at the source, New Cross, to do propaganda work and join any attack emanating from there, and the other to wait in a suitable road, in this case Tanner's Hill, to ambush the National Front march from the side. And the report goes on to describe the breakdown in communications which the CPEML experienced on the day, and some of the tactics that they were thinking of using in future. It also refers to a tactic they used on the day, which was listening to police radio. Now, what I'd like to explore with you is, in a demonstration situation like this, how valuable was it for the SDS to be able to report on last-minute plans, such as those which are referred to in this report?
Oh, I think it was very important.
And in terms of tactics such as listening to police radio, presumably that was something that everybody knew activists could do if they wanted to. Can we take that document down, please, and go to tab 28? This is the 1977 annual report again, and this time I'd like to go to page 14. Sorry, that's 0728981. I'm going to show you this document, then I'm going to show you another, and then I'm going to ask you to compare the two. I'm picking it up about half a dozen lines down, which says, amongst the information regarding numbers and tactics obtained from penetrated extremist groups on this occasion was the fact that an empty house at the junction of New Cross Road and Lorry Grove, opposite Clifton Rise, would be occupied on the night of the 12th of August by members of the Socialist Workers' Party, armed with missiles, intent on attacking the National Front march as it passed that location. As a result, this house was searched and cleared by uniformed police on the morning of the 13th of August 1977, thereby preventing a planned and premeditated act of violence. Clearly very valuable public order intelligence, and would you agree, apparently used well by the uniformed police?
Yes.
Now, if we take that down and look at the document at tab 21, which is MPS-0732-886, this is a report by Les Willingale containing feedback, as we understand it, from SDS officers who were at Lewisham. It contains some background, and then if we go to page 2, there are some comments on the policing of events at Lewisham, which read, despite advance warning that trouble was likely in Lewisham High Street, groups of left-wing supporters and, more importantly, coloured youths were allowed to gather. There was an apparent lack of leadership, and there seemed little police coordination. Properly trained groups of 25 to 30 officers under the command of a senior officer would appear to be the answer. The whole area around Clifton Rise should have been sealed off before the left had occupied it in strength. The National Front march was taken far too close to the main contingent of left-wing supporters. The mounted police were ineffective and presented an excellent target, left-wing tactics being to throw missiles, break and reform after charges. There was an obvious lack of officers patrolling potential trouble spots, and left-wing supporters were allowed to roam free. When riot shields were first used, a number of officers could have found themselves surrounded if certain left-wing groups had received more support from their comrades. They would have gone between and behind the small groups of officers using the shields. Now, some of those criticisms are criticisms about tactical decisions made on the day and perhaps specific to public order policing. But what I would like to know from you is, was there a sense that the intelligence provided by the SDS ahead of the Lewisham demonstration and during the course of the day could have been used more constructively than it actually was?
Yes.
And was anything done about that?
Well, that report, I believe, was passed on, and doubtless A8 didn't love us very much for doing it, but I think it was important that it should be, because clearly the policing had not been as effective as it might have been.
I'm going to move now to the question of the operational security of the SDS. You've explained in your witness statement a little about this, and we've got some documents on the subject. Would it be fair to say that the operational security of the SDS was regarded as paramount?
Yes.
And there is a document in particular that I'd like to take you to. It's from the 1976 annual report. It's at tab 1 of the bundle, sir. It's MPS 0728 980. Page 5, please. And if we could have paragraph 14. That reads, the political sensitivity of the SDS operation is fully recognised by all officers concerned, and to protect the ultimate defence line, great care is taken to ensure that penetration of an organisation can be fully justified on the basis of the Commissioner's responsibility for the preservation of public order of the metropolis. Could you explain, please, what is meant by the phrase, the ultimate defence line?
That if the operation was to become public, the Commissioner had a strong defence. That the police were acting as police are sworn to act in the preservation of the Queen's peace.
And what was the concern if the fact that the SDS was doing what it was doing had come out? What reaction was feared?
Oh, the attack upon the police by the media.
For doing what?
For acting undercover to achieve the result.
Within political groups?
Yes.
And was it feared that that would be an embarrassment for the Commissioner? That's a word we've seen in several of the documents.
Would be an embarrassment if the Commissioner didn't have the defence, and the defence was quite clear, I think.
And to what extent did you keep that in mind when you were head of the SDS?
Oh, I was always aware of the SDS responsibilities and the fact that we were all still police constables.
And how do you square that with taking instructions from the security service about subversive groups that were behaving lawfully?
On the basis that the government had directed that was the way we should operate in support of the security service. And ultimately, of course, the security service has responsibility for the security of the state internally, and therefore, naturally, police should support them.
And in terms of being and always remaining a police officer, how do you square that with doing things such as entering people's homes to attend meetings under a false pretense?
I certainly never saw that as illegal. Now, I'm no lawyer, but I did not see that as illegal.
I think you told me earlier it wasn't a question to which you addressed your mind at all.
No, I didn't.
Can I move now to the safe house meetings, which were twice weekly, weren't there?
Yes.
And you had safe houses in the west of London and the south of London.
Yes.
And you've written in your witness statement, at the twice weekly meetings, everyone would discuss their deployments, who did what, with where, and what was developing in certain areas. And was all of that done communally?
Yes.
How well did you get to know the officers under your command?
I thought very well. If I can just expand on that, the Special Branch as a whole, but SDS in particular, operated on a team basis. We didn't use surnames, we used Christian names. People could say whatever they wanted to and felt that rank wasn't important in that sense. And therefore, we discussed police matters, we discussed family matters. It all came up they weren't formal meetings, they were a gathering of people to deal with specific things like expenses and reports and so on. But largely, they were about, again, keeping the undercover officers understanding they were still policemen, they were still part of policing, part of a police team.
I'm getting the impression that you spoke to them in sufficient detail to know a fair bit about them as people and a great deal about what they were doing undercover.
Yes.
And you were doing that, one reason being to look after their welfare.
Yes.
So you were fully informed. And another reason to ensure that the unit was being run properly and doing its job properly.
Yes.
One of the issues you had to look out for was the stressful nature of undercover policing, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And we don't need to go into the details, but one of your officers, HN351, was withdrawn because of the stress of the job.
If I may consult. Yes.
Another officer has described the attitude of management as being such that the concern for well-being meant that more latitude was shown to officers than would normally be shown. Is that right?
I don't know what somebody meant by more latitude, unless they were thinking of relationship between ranks, maybe.
I'm paraphrasing in terms of bending over backwards to help.
Of course.
Were these conversations quite relaxed? Did you get to know people well enough?
Oh, yes.
And there was some laughing and joking?
Absolutely.
And did that laughing and joking in front of you ever become of a sexual nature?
Only in the sense that some of the jokes would be that way inclined.
Were there any jokes which might have inferred that members of your unit were attracted to members of their groups sexually?
No.
Did any of the banter and joking suggest that any of them might have been conducting a sexual relationship with a member of the public? Can you recall one officer joking to another that a woman would be biting the pillow again tonight or anything to that effect?
No, I would not recall that.
You have said in your witness statement that there was no guidance given to officers about sexual relationships. Was there any discussion in the safe flats about how to put women off if they showed a sexual interest in officers?
No, I recall nothing on that basis.
Can you give me a yes/no answer to this question, please? Did you give any thought to cover girlfriends?
No.
Did you consider that there, despite the disciplinary prohibition on sexual contact, be a risk that some of your officers might be tempted to get involved?
No.
They were pretending to be single men, weren't they?
Yes.
And they were mixing with groups of young people.
Yes.
And many of the groups they were infiltrating had sexually permissive attitudes.
Yes.
One of the fears your officers might naturally have would be of being detected and punished on the spot by their groups.
Yes.
Mightn't it have been a temptation to think that if I form a relationship with a woman, that is the last thing that a police officer ought to be doing, and it will make me more secure in my cover?
I can't say I ever thought that.
Might it have been that if an officer thought, my job is to get the best possible intelligence for the police, one way of doing that might be to form an intimate relationship with somebody well placed to give me that intelligence?
No.
You say no, why not?
Just the thought never went through my mind.
Looking back now, if you had addressed your mind to those issues, would you accept that there was in fact a risk that officers would break the rules and form sexual relationships?
Yes, in hindsight, and clearly that was something one learns as one goes along, and that is something that should have been introduced right at the beginning.
Do you think that you should have expressly made clear and reminded officers that sexual relations were strictly off limits?
Yes.
Do you think it would have helped if there had been more discussion of the subject so that officers who were feeling temptation might have been put off before they went too far?
That is a thought, certainly.
Now, you've made very clear this morning that you are totally against sexual activity between police officers and members of the public. If you didn't give your men any instructions, would they have known that?
Well, I would think so, because as I explained earlier, that was always the rule within the police service.
Do you think you might have said or done anything that gave them that impression that you were a disciplinarian on this issue?
Not that I know of.
At least one witness has told us that they were very clear that that was your attitude. Does that sound credible?
It sounds credible.
Now, in your witness statement, when explaining your opposition to sexual activity between undercover police officers and civilians, you describe the risk to the officer, their identity, their family, and the risk to the operations. First of all, what was the risk to their family that you had in mind?
Well, I think what was going through my mind when I made that statement was the possibility of disease, the effect on the relationship with a wife, and anything they might, an individual officer might have come out with in the course of sexual activity, which could have damaged the operation.
Did you consider they may be under threat from the group that had been infiltrated?
I can't say I considered that at the time.
Were the groups that were being infiltrated, no names please, of a kind that might have posed a threat to the family or not?
The threat to the family I'm thinking of is more the case of transmissible disease and the breakup of a marriage.
Sexually transmitted diseases.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that's missing from your witness statement on this subject is consideration of the woman who is deceived. Why wasn't that mentioned in your witness statement?
I don't think the question was posed. My statements were made in response to questions, and I just gave the answers at the time. So if I didn't mention it, that is why it's not there.
And what is your view so far as the activist or member of the public who is deceived into sexual relationships by one of your undercover officers?
I'm not happy about it, but what is the alternative? Because accepting that rape is not involved, does all sexual activity in terms of modern moral attitudes require a legally endorsed exchange of CVs before sexual activity takes place? And so, to the extent to which the man concerned was operating under false colours, is that something which one could prevent? I don't know. That is the way my mind is working. It's wrong, but how does one prevent it?
In the light of that answer, might I ask you, how would you calibrate the level of contrition?
I am very sad that it happened.
And what would you say to the women concerned?
Well, I would apologise if my officers behaved in a certain way.
Can we go back now? I know you were asked a few questions about this by the chairman earlier this morning, but I want to return to Richard Clarke. Now, he deployed into Goldsmith College, didn't he?
I think that was a move he made as part of being, I think it was SWP, and I think that's how he moved in there. That's what as far as I can remember.
He becomes active in the Troops Out movement, and he's active in setting up the South East London, branch of the Troops Out movement,
Yeah.
And gets involved with a small number of activists who are students at Goldsmith College.
Yes.
Does that refresh your memory?
Yes, thank you.
Now, that atmosphere, perhaps above all others, is one of young people who may be becoming sexually active early in their adult lives, isn't it?
Yes.
And Mr. Clarke goes in there some years older than most students,
Yes.
without any instruction as to how to behave.
Yes.
We are told by his colleagues that he was a womanizer. Are you sure you didn't pick up on that from your conversations with him in the safe house?
I'm quite sure.
Wasn't there a particular risk putting an older man into a college environment with young women?
I did not think of that at the time.
With hindsight.
With hindsight, of course.
Can I move now to HN 300?
Yes.
Can you recall a time when HN 300 was withdrawn from the SDS?
No.
The evidence that we've received is that HN 300 explained to one of his colleagues, one of the fully anonymous officers, that he was falling in love with an activist. The officer's evidence is that he relayed that information to the office, and particularly his recollection was to Detective Inspector McIntosh, and then HN 300 was removed from the SDS. As the head of the SDS at that time, you must have known about something like that, mustn't you?
Well, that's where I am confused, because of course that is something I would have known about. But I didn't, and I don't. And I think something there is confusion somewhere in evidence, because when I was the Chief Inspector at SDS, I remember my number 2 as being Leslie Willingale. I thought part of the time also it was Barry Moss, but I have no recollection of working with Angus McIntosh on the SDS. And I've thought about it because I know that the suggestion is he was there and a timeline had indicated, but without looking at our records of service, I just have no recollection at all of being there with Angus McIntosh. And certainly I have no recollection of the withdrawal of that particular undercover officer from the field. I have none whatsoever.
I know this is an extremely difficult question, and if it's unfair, just say so. But I'd be interested if you can help us with whether you think this might have happened on your watch and you simply cannot remember it, or whether you are saying this did not happen on your watch.
I'm saying I know nothing whatsoever about it, which throws up a question, and I can't answer the question.
Can I move on to Vince Harvey?
Yes.
Now, you managed him, I think, only in the early part of his deployment, which spanned 1976 to 1979. When he started with the SDS, he was in a long-term relationship. That long-term relationship came to an end. Can you remember whether it came to an end whilst you were still serving within the SDS?
No, I cannot.
If you had known that his long-term relationship had come to an end, would that have been a concern to you?
It would have been a concern, and I would have wanted to discuss it with him. But I would be concerned about whether, in fact, he was still happy to stay in the role that he was involved in, or whether perhaps he should consider coming out of the field.
And would you have relied on his judgment on that or not?
I think so, to a large extent.
We know that Vince Harvey slept with 2 women early in his deployment from his oral evidence. Did he tell you anything about that?
No.
Did you learn from any source anything about that?
No, I know nothing about any of these sexual activities, only when the inquiry opened, and I was amazed to learn what I've learned since.
Now, there may be a paradox in your evidence that I'd like to ask you about. One is that so far as the disciplinary regulations relating to sexual misconduct are concerned, you are sure that they continued to apply to your undercover officers.
Yes.
Whereas the law of trespass in relation to entering private homes is one to which you have told us you didn't even address your mind.
That is correct.
Why the distinction?
The law of trespass, I think police training on trespass dealt with the removal of people from premises if they were trespassing. And it was always about having, as a police officer, dealing with the owner or the occupant of premises asking for somebody to be removed. But trespass itself was not an offence. That's my recollection of police training.
But it also applies to the circumstances in which a police officer can enter somebody's home, doesn't it? To obtain evidence and things like that.
Obtaining evidence, of course, one needs a warrant. Didn't think of it at all in terms of the SDS.
Can I move now to the assumption of positions of responsibility within groups? And you have told us in your witness statement that it was a matter for discussion.
Yes, we were not keen on people taking positions of responsibility within a group, because if that group had decided upon illegal activity, I was always had in the back of my mind, and we were constantly reminded of this, that the instructions in what was known as Assistant Commissioner of Crimes Consolidated Instructions, dealing with informants, required that, first of all, that no informant could initiate a crime, and secondly, that no informant could be permitted to take a major part in a crime. And we applied those rules to the SDS so that we had to be in a position where one of our people was not be seen initiating a crime. So being involved at senior level in an organisation could place the police in jeopardy.
But some of the organisations which were being infiltrated weren't committing.
Sorry?
Some of the organisations that were being infiltrated weren't committing serious crimes, were they?
Some were not, but on the other hand, one had to be careful of that.
So in a group which wasn't committing serious crime, was there any inhibition on assuming positions of responsibility?
Not in general terms, but certainly an individual who was in that situation would discuss that with management, and probably another solution would have to be found. There was one occasion, I won't go into details,
All rise, please.
I have made and signed a restriction order which is being printed and will be put up at the entrance to the hearing room and distributed to the tables in the public area to the following effect. There shall be no disclosure or publication made of the information stated during the hearing on 18th May 2022, today, between the times 12:23 a.m. and 12:33 a.m.
PM, sir.
PM. Thank you. 12:23 p.m. and 12:33 p.m. The order does not prevent you from revealing to the outside world that a restriction order has been made in respect of that information. Because we have had this unexpected interruption, I'm now going to adjourn the proceedings until 5 to 2 to enable everybody to get, I'm afraid, a slightly curtailed lunch. Mr. Craft, please don't concern yourself about this event. It was always bound to occur sometime. This is simply the first occasion on which it has.
Thank you, sir.
I'd be very
Clearly,
surprised.
I said something that maybe made life difficult.
I'd be very surprised if it's the last. Until 5-2.